So, hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Laura. Sorry, I warned you about the swivel chair. It's straight. Yeah. I'm Laura Lowen. I am the curator and collections manager for the Eleanor D. Wilson Museum, and it is my pleasure to introduce Rachel Burgess tonight. Rachel Burgess received her B.A. in 2004 from Yale University, followed by her M.F.A. in illustration from the School of Visual Arts in New York, where she currently teaches workshops all around the city while maintaining her studio practice. She has received several residencies and awards, including in 2021, an Artist Development Program Award from the International Print Center of New York, a 2016 Artist Residency with ZMA's Printmaking, and her artworks are in collections all over the world. Burgess combines elements of illustration, folk art, and oil painting into her monotypes and sculptures. Particles and Waves, on view in the museum until June 6th, is an exploration into how childhood experiences are transformed into memories, and those memories into building blocks of an internal narrative that forms how we interact with the world. While Particles and Waves is based upon a childhood in New England, the work calls all of us to look back and within ourselves to the place where we keep our own building blocks and what stories we choose to carry on today. So please join me in a warm Holland's welcome for Rachel Burgess.
Thank you so much, Laura. It's great to be here. Thank you to the curatorial team for having me. And thank you all for coming. My name is Rachel. As Laura said, I am a visual artist. I currently live in New York City. And I'm going to talk about particles and waves. And as Laura was saying, one of the main ideas behind this show was reflecting on how we develop an aesthetic vocabulary over time, sort of what images influence us and contribute to the way that we perceive the world. So I'm going to start in New England, which is where I grew up. I grew up outside of Boston, and just share with you sort of four main influences that stem from my childhood and continue to influence my work today. Here's a photograph from sometime in the 1980s of a typical New England, scene. I went on many car trips, day excursions, nature walks, and hikes with my family, and I absorbed a lot of these sort of simple, iconic New England forms. So things like rock walls, meadows, pine trees, the changing cloud formations, not only the ocean, but some tidal saltwater marshes that are a common feature of New England. Also the old architecture, the colonial era wooden buildings, wooden piers, wooden boats. I saw these forms in the world around me, but also they were reiterated at home. This was my grandfather, who, when he retired, loved to work with wood and actually began building wooden boats in his basement. So something that I helped him do as a child was learn how to lay the strips for wooden canoes and things like that. So I was also internalizing this sort of iconography at home. And then when I was about 10, we lived outside of Boston, and my parents bought a summer house in Maine. It's sort of fake Maine. It's right over the border from New Hampshire in the first town in the state. And this is the view from the backyard. So to me, this view became very important and began to symbolize what the New England landscape meant. It has the marshes, the saltwater marsh, the pine trees in the distance. And then beyond them, you can see there's the river, the Piscataqua River, which separates Maine from New Hampshire. And then the far banks are New Hampshire. And to the left of us is the Atlantic Ocean. So this view shows up in my artwork again and again and again. I was also taken to a lot of regional art museums as a kid, sometimes unwillingly, but at 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, we would take these drives around New England, and I saw a lot of sort of 19th century New England painting. I'm going to share 4 of the artists who I looked at as a kid and who continue to influence my work. The first is Martin Johnson Heade, who was a 19th century painter famous for 2 very different bodies of work. He made really luscious paintings of orchids, and he made a series of paintings of New England salt marshes, which is what stuck with me. So as you can see, like in the photos, you have the sort of wet grasslands, the changing weather patterns, the light. I also looked at a lot of Winslow Homer paintings. He is obviously famous for many things, including his paintings of the Civil War, but he spent a bunch of time up in Maine, and so some of his paintings deal with the way the light falls on the water, the rocky cliff lines, the wooden boats and the sailing ships, a very New England feel. Also very kind of moody and atmospheric, which I was drawn to. These are 2 slightly lesser known 19th century New England artists. This is Arthur Wesley Dow. I'm including him because this was an early introduction that I had to printmaking. In addition to making oil paintings, Arthur Wesley Dow looked at a lot of Asian art and was influenced by Asian woodblock prints. And here are some woodblock pieces that he made of New England. So again, there's the marsh, and you can see the haystacks in the distance, the wooden boat. But I was very struck by his compositions. And this is another New England printmaker, Blanche Lazelle. She also made woodblock prints, and she's famous for her white line technique, which you can see on the image on the right. It just means that the way you're carving the wood and then inking it and printing it, you're leaving these white spaces around the different forms. But I really loved how simple her images were. I loved the compositions and also these simplified versions of the piers, the houses, the wharves, things like that. The third biggest influence that I remember from childhood are actual books for children, artwork for children. So I loved illustrated books. I loved reading, and I also, having seen some of these painters in museums and things like that, I was very excited about seeing artwork that felt special and thoughtful, but that was designed for kids and, designed to be more accessible. These are 2 books by Barbara Cooney. You guys might be familiar with them, Miss Rumphius and the Oxcart Man, but both are set in New England. And so I could see in her illustrations those same shapes and colors and subject matter that were in these more formal paintings, but in a digestible form. This is a spread from the Oxcart Man, which depicts the countryside in New Hampshire during the autumn. I have not read interviews with her, but my guess is that as she worked, she was referencing sort of early colonial New England artwork and those sort of naive paintings that were made by painters who might not have been formally trained or not trained in Europe, but were creating their own almost folk art. And I really responded to that style in her work. And here's another illustrator. Even as I got older and was reading chapter books, I really loved it whenever they included pictures. So N.C. Wyeth illustrated classics like Robin Hood on the left, Treasure Island on the right. obviously neither of these books is set in New England, but something about the quality of his light and his sort of atmospheric effects resonated with me. And he too spent time up in Maine painting. And I felt like that came through in his illustrations. This is just a photo of me and my sister. I was probably in third grade, but you can see like these stories were deeply affecting me. And yeah, I loved storytelling and I loved reading. So as I got older, that became a major focus for me. This is the fourth and final early influence. It's a example of a cassette tape that my dad would make and force us to listen to on our car rides all over the region. And my sister and I, we hated these at the time, but we were brainwashed. And what my dad would do is record folk music off of the local radio station or his records, put it on these tapes, and then we'd listen to this in the car. So these folk songs, which were often old and old enough to be songs where there was not an original version of the song, if that makes sense. So we were listening to ballads and things where many singers had sung these songs over time. This kind of music became indelibly linked in my mind with the scenery that we were driving past. And one thing that really facilitated the impact that these songs had on me is like the illustrated books, they were very simple. The stories were simply told. As a kid, I could understand the storyline, which was often very dark. The ballads would be violent, or there'd be adultery or death. But they were catchy stories and catchy melodies, and they would get stuck in your head. And so I really grew to love this kind of music. So when I got to college, I didn't think about pursuing art. I became a literature major, and senior year, I had to write a thesis. Sounds like some of you might be in your senior year working on thesis projects. So I chose to study this man whose name is Francis James Child. He was a professor at Harvard in the 19th century, and he collected old English and Scottish ballads. So he compiled about 300 of them into 5 volumes. This is my bookshelf at home. And sort of preserved them. So as my thesis project, I studied these narratives and I thought about their structure. And I ended up writing about the way that old ballads build up to a climactic event and then unwind again. So their endings are often abrupt and sort of quiet, but they set themselves up in such a way that you're almost ready to start repeating the whole song again. Almost the way you might with a lullaby. Like that simple melody can just be repeated over and over. And I loved that idea that art could not be A to Z, where you're telling a story that is very contained, but that it might become renewable or cyclical. And I also loved the idea that it could be iterative. It's not that one version of the song belonged to someone and that was it and it was definitive. These songs could be revisited and reinterpreted again and again. So those were 2 major takeaways for me from this rather useless senior year project. And before we move on from ballads, here's just an example of one. A lot of them cross the Atlantic, and actually in West Virginia and Kentucky, and there is this ballad culture where there are American versions of some of these European songs. So Barbary Allen is just sort of a famous classic ballad, but you can see how simple the storytelling is. There's not a lot of action until he dies, and then the song kind of unwinds and lends itself to repetition. and revisitation. After college, I did start to think about art as a career. I had taken drawing and painting classes, and I decided to go to grad school for illustration because that felt like the perfect way to meld my interest in literature with my interest in art. In grad school, I was introduced to the print shop. So it was the first time where I had a chance to do some printmaking. And for my subject matter, as I was trying to explore illustration, I used folk songs. So I actually illustrated some of these ballads that I had been studying. These are two illustrations of a song called Vincent Black Lightning, 1952, by a contemporary British folk singer about a guy, a girl, and a motorcycle. And these are etchings. So I began to explore printmaking techniques. An etching is where you take a metal plate and you're carving into it with something sharp, like an etching needle, then running ink over the plate, wiping the excess ink off so it's only sitting now in your lines of your drawing. And then you put a sheet of paper on top and run it through a printing press so you get a print. And the thing about an etching is, like many forms of printmaking, you can make one copy, but you can also make 50 copies because your drawing is carved into the plate, so it's always there. Here's another old ballad that I illustrated in grad school. This is a child ballad called Little Musgrave, and the American version of this is Mattie Groves. If anyone's ever heard that song? Big floor.
Yeah.
So, and again, these are etchings, so you can see the lines that I had carved in the plate, and then I'm printing it. And then in my final semester of grad school, I was introduced to monotype, which was a new form of printmaking for me, where you only get one print, which is why it's called monotype. You're painting on a plate, a metal or a plastic plate, putting a sheet of paper on top and running it through the printing press like a glorified stamp. So once you do that, the image that you painted gets like smushed, for lack of a better word, and you wipe it away off the plate and that's it. And I started to develop this practice where I would go up to Maine. At this point, I had moved to New York City. So I would go up to Maine, make drawings from life on location, like of this pier, and then bring those drawings back to the print studio where I would use them as the reference for my pieces. And the final thing about monotype and any form of printmaking is when you print it, it reverses because it is like a stamp. And when I discovered monotype, I really felt like I had found my process because I loved that it was a work on paper and it required a printing press. So it felt connected to book arts, graphic arts, the world of commercial illustration, in a way that I didn't feel about, oil painting on canvas. But at the same time, it's a very painterly process. It's very expressionistic. You're just getting one copy. It felt like the perfect bridge of those two worlds. And I love the fact that your image comes out backwards because that had an element of fictionalization in it, where I felt as though, okay, I'm not trying to make representational work. I'm storytelling. So this is the print studio in Manhattan where I work today. It's a communal space because it has several large printing presses in it. And I have large sheets of plexiglass that I paint on. So on the left-hand side, you can see there's my plexiglass. I am referring to sketches still. So this image is based on a pastel drawing that I made up in Maine. You might recognize the view. This is that Piscataqua River with the marsh in the foreground. I am using a combination of oil-based etching and litho inks. And I come in, I mix my colors, and then I paint with rollers instead of brushes. again, I'm trying to distance myself a bit from all the history and the baggage that comes with paintbrushes on canvas and landscape painting. This is my way of just taking a breath from that and working in a crude, like almost pixelated manner that feels a little more folksy to me. And you can see sometimes I use Q-tips and cardboard. So all of the tools I'm using are very quotidian and not very fancy. Once I finish the painting, I bring it over to the printing press and I lay a big sheet of paper on top of it and run it through the press. So you get this one-off impression, and then I hang it up to dry. And then I wipe the plate clean. The image no longer exists. It's almost like a memory. You know, you're like creating a memory. As I began to make more and more monotypes and work bigger and bigger, I had two goals. One was how far can I push this medium to really make big pieces? Because in a sense, you're limited by the size of the printing press. So a painter could make a 40 by 60 canvas, but I don't have a 40 by 60 press. So I started to think about working in diptychs, where I'm creating two separate paintings and then placing them, you know, two separate monotypes and placing them side by side to create the whole image. And I really liked this idea because not only could I work bigger, but it it felt like making pages of a book. I liked that it felt like opening a book and seeing the two halves there in front of me. So this piece is called Pink Waves. It's in the show right now, Particles and Waves. It's about 40 inches tall by 60 wide. And it was based on a sketch of the Piscataqua River, and I painted one half on plexiglass, printed it, wiped the plexiglass clean, and printed the second half. So you can see it doesn't quite align perfectly. I'm not interested in perfection. I actually like that roughness, that crudeness. And then I wanted to push that even further. So I started to make triptychs and I started to look at more of that Asian art that had inspired some of my favorite New England artists. So I began to think about not just illustrated books and their format, but paneled screens, illustrated scrolls, and like other forms of visual storytelling. Here are two of the Japanese artists whose work I really focused on. This is Hokusai. You might be familiar with his famous series, 36 Views of Mount Fuji. This is a very famous image, the Great Wave off Kanigawa. So he did 36 separate images of the mountain from different perspectives. And you can see in this one, it's sort of famous for him, you know, he placed the mountain, it's actually very small in the distance. But I loved that idea of revisiting one place again and again. And I also loved the fact that these wood cuts, when they were made, I mean, he's hugely famous now, but at the time, he would have been creating them for normal people to buy, and he could have made, you know, many copies of them. And I liked that sort of popular art aspect to it. It felt related to illustration. And this is Utagawa Hiroshige, who did 100 Famous Views of Edo, a similar idea. So he revisited the same landscape 100 times over different times of the year and different seasons. And I loved that idea of working serially to tell a story, but with a very narrow subject matter. So in 2018, I started a series that I called 100 Views of the Piscataqua, where I took sketches of that view from my family's home up in Maine, and I began to make 100 distinct monotypes of that view. So here's a sketch I made in winter. You can see everything is kind of brown and dead. I would go up there at different times of the year. I tried to sketch at different times of day or night and create this sort of deep dive into this one location. Here are a few other images from the series. Again, I was really thinking a lot about Hiroshige, but some images have the moon, some have the sun, some have elements in the foreground, like these grasses. The one in the center is from winter time. And as I was working through the series, I was offered a show in New Hampshire to exhibit the first 50 pieces in the summer of 2020. So obviously in spring of 2020, COVID hit. And these are my two children at the show, which did happen, but it was very limited as to who could come. Everyone was in masks. And suddenly all these life events began to inform the work. The fact that I had had two kids who were now moving from being toddlers into children, the fact that COVID had struck, my grandfather passed away, the fact that I was sort of transitioning from my 30s into my 40s, it felt like there was now a narrative attached to this series. And so after 2020, it took me 2 more years to finish the series. I kept working on it until 2022, but I began to think of it differently and to think about how could I actually tell a story using these images and make them more than just 100 pieces of art. So what I did is I thought about the structure of those ballads that I had loved, where they build up to a central climax and then unwind again. And I began to search for different texts from my life that I could use to piece together a story. I wasn't trying to write it. I was trying to build on all these influences in my life and use them to tell the narrative. So in the artist book that I've created that is on display in Particles and Waves, I have taken literary excerpts, family journals, family emails, Instagram posts, artist statements as they've evolved over the years, newspaper articles, recipes, and I've woven them together to tell a story that begins in childhood and builds up towards COVID and then unwinds again to the current day. And to set a story up that could be repeated again, seeing the growth of my children, or just this idea that it will all happen again on a certain level. This is a page from early in the book, and you can tell it's an excerpt from Charlotte's Web. A lot of the literary excerpts that I chose either have to do with love or death or storytelling. This is page 50 in the book, so it's right smack in the middle. And it is a New York Times article that came out in January 2020, talking about a new disease being watched in China. This is from a few pages later in the book, and it is a transcription of the last voicemail that I have from my grandfather before he died. Something I was also thinking about when I was choosing the text for the book is technology and how that has evolved over the course of these events. So early in the book, there are some lullabies, there are some excerpts from a handwritten journal that my grandmother kept when we were young. But as the book goes on, there's the introduction of email, voicemail and voicemail transcriptions, Instagram posts, like I was saying. There's one page where I asked ChatGPT to write a 21st century child ballad. So just this idea that, the way we are telling stories is evolving. Here is a page from towards the end of the book. This is an excerpt from Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Dillard, and it is where I chose the title for this show. I'm just going to read the excerpt. Particles and waves. Here is the word from a subatomic physicist. Everything that has already happened is particles. Everything in the future is waves. Let me twist his meaning. Here it comes. The particles are broken. The waves are translucent, laving, roiling with beauty like sharks. The present is the wave that explodes over my head, flinging the air with particles at the height of its breathless unroll. It is the live water and light that bears from undisclosed sources the freshest news, renewed and renewing, world without end. I chose this and I put it towards the end of the book because I loved that message of renewal. When I read Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, it obviously resonated because Annie Dillard was doing a deep dive into a specific place and following it over the course of the seasons and then times of day. But I felt like part of her message was also about renewability, and that whatever we see and feel that is momentous is both very, very small and also very, very universal and will happen again, even if it's without us. So I took my title from her for that reason. And the final body of work in Particles and Waves are little wooden sculptures that I decided to make because the show is about influences and about how we come to have a specific artistic vision or a specific way of looking at the world over time. And I wanted to try to capture that feeling in 3 dimensions. So, not only did my grandfather work in wood when I was young, but I played with these kind of standard classroom unit blocks as a kid. Maybe some of you have seen them as well. They're just the simple geometric blocks, and they sort of begged to be used to me because you only get a limited number of shapes. So it felt almost like an alphabet. Like, here is a vocabulary, and what can I do with it? So I tried to look at the blocks in that way, almost as though they were a drawing tool. What can I build with these blocks that expresses the story I'm trying to tell? I created cardboard cutouts where I would scale up the blocks to some extent to make them more iconic and a little more momentous. And then I worked with a really nice toy company in Minnesota that actually makes classroom unit blocks. And they said, sure, we'll play around with this with you. So I asked them to create larger versions of some of their classic blocks. And then I made these sculptures. So on the left is sunset, on the right is barge. Again, just this idea of very simple forms that feel accessible to everyone, not just people who are interested in art, but children. I was trying to link it back to that interest in illustration and this non-elite form of art. I'm just going to end on this image from the show. This is called It's Not Dark Yet, Pink. It is the view of the Piscataqua. It has a lot of the elements that I've mentioned where there's sort of these very simple, almost pixelated forms, atmospheric colors, the composition that is influenced by New England artists and who were influenced in their turn by Asian artists. And I would just like to close by saying that, as you can see, a lot of the ideas for this show began when I was in college. And so, if you're graduating soon or thinking about your next step, it's a really great time to reflect on your own, as Laura called them, building blocks, and how they will impact whatever projects you go out and do in the world. But it's an age where you can start to see how all your influences come together and how they'll keep affecting what you do next. So thank you so much. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Anyone has questions about the work? Yes.
I love that you talk about different artistic influences, and I'm just curious, like, do you have any modern or really contemporary artists who you're looking to? Because some of them, like Alex Katz, came to mind.
Mm-hmm. I do. Well, speaking of Alex Katz, some of you may know Lois Dodd, who is a female artist and a contemporary of Alex Katz, and she painted for Maine for many years, and is having a heyday right now. And I think she's 94 or something, but her work has exploded and it's phenomenal. So I love Lois Dodd. As far as someone who's not, in the books yet, but who is, I think, a fantastic contemporary artist, was Eleanor K. Ray, who I know showed here. And I think you have one of her paintings in the hall, but she does small, sort of intimate landscapes that I think are quite beautiful. Yeah, Lois Dodd is one that I've seen recently who I've been following to her different, museum shows and things like that. But yeah. Yeah.
How do you choose with your 100 views which piece of text to pair with which print?
That's a great question. I kept the 100 views, the images chronological. So I didn't try to rearrange. So for instance, that one that fell on page 50 when the news of COVID that I paired with the announcement of COVID, that happened to be the 50th piece that I had made. So that sort of helped because I was keeping that arm of things steady. Mm-hmm. And then for the text, I also tried to keep it kind of chronological. And there are a few instances where I broke the rules. I think there's one called Moon where I did tie it to a moon piece. And it's the text is me as an 6-year-old practicing the letter M over and over and over again. But mostly they're chronological. And I also tried to vary, what I was using. So not too many emails in a row and to keep it fresh. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Are you looking at any other childhood places to revisit like this in different lights or like things you're thinking of?
Yes. I've actually been thinking about adding figures into my work. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to think about how to incorporate this scenery and these elements, which have really become my vocabulary, as sort of a backdrop for figures and probably family members. Yes. Yeah. And working with rollers is a challenge because I've done a lot of portrait drawing, but you can't make a perfect looking portrait with rollers. So I think it'll really be a test of like embracing the crudeness of the tool. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Everyone, please join